Chapter 15. One of my favorites. I've got a couple things to say up front. Number one, there is much more that could be said about this topic. I mean, I took a course on the Reformation. We started with John Wycliffe back in the 1100s and went all the way through to the John Calvin in the 1500s. And we went through the Waldensians, the Albigensians, and a whole bunch of others that your book will not mention, Jan Hus. But we're going to go through much faster and be through with it by the next class period on Tuesday, because we got a whole semester's worth of work history to cover. But believe me, I could spend a whole semester talking about chapter 15. Something else I want to try to make as clear as I can, folk. In no way do I mean to be favoring any one religion over another, but for this chapter, there is no way for me to leave out religious controversy. I can no more leave out theology in this chapter than I could tell you the story of the Titanic and leave out that terrible part about the iceberg. It can't be done. And I noticed one teacher that's still working here who taught this class and just completely left out this whole chapter. I'm not going to do that. I mean, because to me it's a very important chapter, and it talks about a couple of very important topics that explains what helps make the modern Europe what it is. Again, it can't be left out. So again, hopefully nobody will feel that if you're of a certain religious persuasion that I'm slamming you. I don't mean to be. I mean, I had a couple of students loan me a DVD about Martin Luther, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, which I watched. It turned out the DVD was made by 2 Catholic priests. And both of these Catholic men said Martin Luther was really our boy, which was true in the beginning, and he was right. Today, even the Catholic Church, and I've seen the Catholic Church, will tell you Martin Luther was right. And that they had some things about that needed reform. All right, reform. I have been to some of my class reunions. At these reunions, they give out awards. There is one award that they give out that I have never received, and an award that I do not want. Yeah, my wife wound up getting that award. But when I was discussing this with an older lady at Lockheed one time, she said, yeah, isn't it the truth? You would not want that award. She knew a little bit what I was like as a young man. The award I'm talking about is the award for least changed. If you've gotten such an award, I'd say more power to you. You might get the impression I don't altogether like what I was as a young man. In some ways, I don't. If I have not changed, I have failed. What does this have to do with this topic? This topic is the story of the Reformation. People who made a change. Now, I talked to a man from another part of the world, again, when I was at Lockheed, and he said, well, where I come from, we never had a Reformation. As if somehow that was a big plus. I felt like saying to him, no, but you needed one. I couldn't quite bring myself to say that. Everybody, unless you are perfect already and have gotten it right the first time, everybody needs a Reformation. If where you came from you didn't have one, likely you should have. The Europeans did have a Reformation, and it wound up propelling them to overtake much of the globe, to eventually invent the airplane, the automobile, the radio, the computer, all kinds of things. The groundwork for it was laid right here, folk, during the time period we're talking about. Reformation. Perhaps we should begin our story, well, with backing up a little bit, the period of time called the Renaissance. The Renaissance was where Europeans woke up. It's called a rebirth, reawakening. They woke up and began to inquire. They began to seek new inventions, and they also began to copy inventions. Some of them went to China and copied what they'd seen in China. And most notably, they copied the Chinese sails, the Chinese rudders, the wheelbarrow. But the most important invention they copied was the printing press. Hey, without the printing press, folk, it would take months to print up a book like this by hand. And it would cost several months' wages. The cost would be prohibitive for the ordinary person. Books were few, far between, and expensive. The novel was impossible. Then came the press, and books could be stamped off. To write a book, one crew of men might be working on this page, another crew over here working on that page, another crew working on that page, then it would all come together. And when it came time to stamp off the pages, one crew would be stamping off this page, another crew stamping off that, then another crew would be assembling the pages. They could put out hundreds of books a day, all identical, all with the same copy. It enabled ideas to be disseminated much more cheaply and much more rapidly, and got Europe started off eventually on an industrial revolution and on a scientific revolution, which we'll talk about in the chapters ahead. Now, in addition, about this time, kings were beginning to build up their power, and that's what we'll talk about the second part of the chapter. Before this time, your kings oftentimes were figurehead, and the nobles really ran Europe. But kings began to build up their power more and more during this time period we're talking about. The social classes, and we're going to run into this as we go along. There were three main classes, class 1, 2, 3. The first class being the clergy. That was your priests, your bishops, archbishop, and pope. Second class being the nobility. These were the kings and the nobles who ruled. And then the third class being everyone else. At the bottom of the commoners were the serfs. The serfs were looked on as being property. They were owned, but they could not be sold. And again, that's the difference between the serf and the slave. He could not be sold. So if a serf married, he could not expect at some point his wife would be sold to another master, or he might be sold to another master. No, serfs were not allowed to be sold. Slavery then was outlawed in Europe for about 1,500 or so years. Now, keep these three classes in mind. These are going to become very important when we talk about the French Revolution about 4 or 5 chapters from now. These were the three estates. These estates here were privileged. They did not pay taxes. And speaking of paying taxes, it's only been about 20 years ago that Queen Elizabeth II decided to pay taxes. She said, my ancestors never paid. And you say, hey, this is a different time era, Your Majesty. Even nobility now pays. And she finally paid, but we had a vice president 40 years ago who had to resign, Spiro Agnew would name. His crime, tax evasion. If he had been living in Europe at the time, tax evasion was considered a privilege. Now it isn't anymore. European nobles now have to pay taxes, even royalty pays taxes. But even as recent as 40 years ago, European nobility were exempt from taxes. They were considered a privileged class. Now, I've already mentioned the printing press and how it's disseminated books and got new ideas out. In addition, Europeans were improving economically by banking. The banking system is set up. Hey, without banks, folks, most of us could never afford to buy a home or a car. Again, banks can afford to take risks on people in making loans that an ordinary person could not afford to do. And our whole economy, hey, without banking, put it this way. I mean, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and Lockheed made its money selling airplanes, and they would go sometimes months at a time without selling a plane. Well, how would they have paid its workers without a bank? Well, we might have gone 5 or 6 months without receiving a paycheck, then all of a sudden received a big check for 40 or more thousand bucks, which had to last we never knew how long. I mean, I'm speaking hypothetically. Now, this did not actually happen, you understand? What actually happened, we all got our paychecks on Fridays. But I'm saying, what if there had been no banks? Well, we'd have gotten our paychecks whenever the company had the money to give them to us, which might have taken months at a time. No, it might have been big when we got it, but then we'd never know when the next one was coming in, and we'd have to be really careful how we budget. But again, the modern economic system we have would be impossible without banks. We just have to all be careful that we don't overdraw, overborrow. Now, one person I want to mention before I get involved with the Reformation is Machiavelli. You'll hear Machiavelli's name from time to time. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. And in his book he said, a ruler, is above all moral standards. Rulers do not have to abide by any standard of morality. The ruler can lie, can cheat, can murder, anything at all to keep order in his realm. But at the same time, he must pretend that he's an honorable man, pretend to be truthful, pretend to be upright, but at the same time, behind the scenes, doing all kinds of scheming and conniving in order to get his way. Richard Nixon was called a Machiavellian, and we've had from time to time someone you'll hear in the news make reference to Machiavelli. He's a Machiavellian dictator, a Machiavellian ruler, a person who pretends to be upright and morally clean, but at the same time does anything that's necessary. And Napoleon Bonaparte was a Machiavellian. We'll talk more about Napoleon later. He was a Machiavellian ruler. And he said, and I quote, "Morality has nothing to do with one such as I." His idea, no, not my ideas by any means, but that was his idea. All right, now into the Reformation itself. The Reformation was preceded by a man named Erasmus. It was said that he laid the egg that Luther hatched. He was a little bit older than Luther. He lived a long time, and his life overlapped Luther's by several years. And in his old age, they said, "You know, you're the man who's given the credit for laying the egg that Luther hatched." He said, "Yes, but I don't like the bird that flew out of the egg." Erasmus at one time was criticized by Catholic and Protestant. He was a Catholic, but he was a writer. He wrote several books, and in his books he would condemn the bad policies of the church. The church listened. He was not persecuted, and most people in a church knew, yeah, this is wrong. Well, what can you do about it? They let it ride. But he would soundly condemn the practices of the church. And his ideas were eventually picked up by Martin Luther. And some of the practices of the church that he condemned was the clergy at this time, and folks, this is right out of your book. The clergy seemed very indifferent to the people it was serving. While the people felt like that their spiritual needs were not being met, the clergy lived in luxury. Typically, a bishop would have 3 different bishoprics he'd preside over, and he'd spend maybe 1 month there with this bishopric, then go and spend another month with that one, which meant that when a person was dying, a lot of times no bishop was available to see to him. There was a shortage of bishops, and again, a lot of your clergy bought their offices, where their wealthy father, noble father, would make his oldest son the next Like if the father was a duke, he'd make his oldest son the next duke, and then make his other son a bishop. And they would typically buy offices. All this was helped to make the church unpopular. There was also the issue of relics. A relic was a holy item that was intended to, we might say, bring good luck to the person who held it. One of the more common relics was the relic of the splinter from the cross. And folk, to this day, we do not know if any splinters of the cross actually exist, but there were several of them, and there were enough splinters to make several crosses, so they could not have all been genuine. But another popular relic was the relic of the Holy Lance, the spear that was used to pierce Jesus. And if you think this is myth and fable, as recently as World War II, Adolf Hitler stole what he thought was the Holy Lance from Austria, and he believed it was going to help him give victories in battle. And it did give him victories until somehow the lance was stolen from him. And then his army started losing. Hey, you can decide for yourself what you believe about it, but some of this is undercover history that you can look into yourself if you choose to. But again, whether or not the lance had anything to do with Hitler's victories or not, the fact is, even Adolf Hitler believed in it. And that is important. The most popular relic was the elusive Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus used during his Last Supper. And again, that seems to have been lost to history. We do not know where the Holy Grail is, or if it will ever turn up, or if it still exists, or what the status of it is. There have been several cups that people have claimed that this is the Grail that was used. Anyway, these were the relics. Suppose if you had like a joint of a finger of a certain saint, this would bring you good luck. Or if you had the clothing worn by a certain saint, the church at this time, the people seemed to love relics. Now we come to the part that really wound up splitting Christendom right into more than anything else. I can never talk about indulgences, folks, without blushing. In a minute, you might know why. Basically, I mean, the purpose of the indulgences was to help a person spend much less time in purgatory. But it wound up being something that you could buy for yourself to make sure that you yourself didn't spend any time in purgatory. It grew and evolved until by the time of the late 1400s, if a person wanted to commit a certain sin, he would go to the priest, and he would name the priest he wanted. He would name to the priest the sin he wanted to commit. He and the priest would decide on how much money he should pay to buy forgiveness for this sin. Again, the bigger the sin, the more money you had, the more the priest would try to gouge you for. And finally, when you'd haggle a little bit and decide on a fee for the sin, the priest would write you out a bill of indulgency that guaranteed forgiveness for that sin. But both you and the priest knew that as soon as you were outside his door, you were going to at least try to commit the sin that you had just purchased forgiveness for. Now, if you think there's something bad about the theology, everybody today thinks so too. What's that? Indulgency. The practice was indulgencies, buying forgiveness for a sin you'd want to commit. This was, now the sale of indulgences was so widespread that St. Peter's, the big palace of the popes today, was built largely with money collected from the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences went on for about 300 or 400 years, and during which time it got bigger and bigger, and as a church would try to get more and more money from its people. Again, the sale of indulgences was one of the main things that Martin Luther used as an excuse for challenging the church. Actually, it began with Pope Innocent III in the 1100s. And it went on through the 1200s, 1300s, and by the late 1400s it evolved to where, what I described, where persons were buying forgiveness for their own sins. At one time it was, and it still remained this throughout, was to pray a loved one out of purgatory. Purgatory being a place of temporary punishment, but the purgatory could last for some supposedly millions of years. All right, this takes us up to Martin Luther. Martin Luther was born to a moderately, well, a common family, but his father was an industrious man who eventually became foreman of the mine that he was working in. Martin Luther was sent to school, and he did well in school, so well that his father wanted him to become a lawyer, practice law, and leave the work, the hard labor of the mines. Now, Martin Luther, as a youngster, said that my father whipped me a lot, and he said my father, in fact, may have been too harsh on me, but he said maybe he was right, because in later life I was going to need all the discipline I could get. Whatever the case, as Martin Luther grew up, he began to fear eternal punishment more than anything else. I mean, when he was with the crowd, he appeared to be a jovial, happy-go-lucky, easy-going young man. Then he would get alone in his room at night, and he could not go to sleep without praying long prayers, because he believed that he was a very bad sinner and unworthy of any kind of salvation, and that he was going to be lost forever and ever in the fires of hell. He feared this. Well, he was on his way home one day when a thunderstorm came up, and he did something I hope you wouldn't do in that situation. He got under a tree to seek shelter. During a thunderstorm, he became terrified, but expecting to be hit by lightning. Again, when I say it's what you shouldn't do, he should have found a ditch or a low point and got into the ditch, even if he got soaking wet. But he had no business getting on a tree. Anyway, he was not hit by lightning. But he felt he was unworthy to pray to Jesus. No, I'm not, but he even felt he was unworthy to pray to Jesus' mother Mary. So he prayed to Mary's mother Anna and said, Saint Anna, if you will let me survive this, I will become a monk. He survived the storm, went home, told his father he was going to become a monk. His father was very upset. He said, I had better things for you. And also old Hans Luther realized that if Martin Luther became a monk, he would never have grandchildren, because the monks took vows of chastity. By the way, Martin Luther did later marry and did have children. But initially, he became a monk, went into the monastery, and spent his time cleaning latrines, walking on hot coals, lying on beds of spikes, all kinds of ways to doing a lot of fasting. He'd whip himself to try to find peace of mind. He couldn't. At one point, he spent 6 hours in front of a priest, and finally the priest said, I'll tell you what you need to do, Martin. You need to get to work, become a college professor, become a teacher, and you'll get your mind off your mind. So Luther got his doctor's degree, became a teacher, professor, and for a few years, we don't hear anything about it. Then at one point he went to Rome expecting he would find righteousness and holiness in Rome, and he saw more worldliness there than he had seen in Germany. And he came home more disillusioned than ever. All this was still taking its toll on him until one day he read the passage in Romans, the just shall live by faith. And he said, hey, I've been living wrong all along. All I have to do is believe that I'm saved and I will be saved. So he began preaching a doctrine of justification by faith. And as he read his Bible, because in those days Bibles were becoming more and more commonplace thanks to the invention of the printing press. Without the press to carry Luther's ideas, the Protestant Reformation might never have gotten started. And without the press to make Bibles cheaper, again, they might never started. Martin Luther began to say, hey, the church has drifted far from the practices told in the Bible. And he finally nailed onto a castle of Wurtemberg, Germany. And by the way, that church still stands. And suppose the door on that church is the same door with the same nail hole that Luther, even though the paper was long since rotted away. But he nailed on the door of the church 95 areas where he disagreed with the church. And he said, I challenge anyone to debate me. The church sent some people to debate him. And the debaters could not overcome him. There was one really expert debater who they initially said had defeated Luther in the debate until they got to thinking about it, and then they wound up saying, oh, we really believe Luther won. And it reminds me of the 2000 presidential debates between Al Gore and George Bush, where the press said Al Gore won. Then they got to research and found Al Gore had manufactured a few facts conveniently that just were not so. And then the American people spoke up and said, hey, George Bush won. Even the press had to turn around and say, no, George Bush